a recent study has found that many cocoa products are contaminated by heavy metals. These are metals naturally found in the Earth's crust, and almost all agricultural products have some level of them. Researchers at George Washington University analyzed 72 consumer cocoa products over an 8-year period. They found that 43% of the products studied exceeded the maximum allowable dose level for lead, while 35% of the products had higher than allowed levels of cadmium. Surprisingly, organic labeled products showed higher levels of both metals. Still, researchers say small amounts of dark chocolate and other cocoa products pose a minimal risk for most people. And let's get you more on that information just now. Joining us to help discuss more is the study's co-author, Dr. Leigh Frame. She's the Executive Director of Integrative Medicine and the co-director of the Frame-Corr Lab at George Washington University. Thanks so much for joining us. So for someone who practically lives on eating dark chocolate, it's my one indulgence. This was really an eye-opening study. What were some of the key takeaways?
Yeah, so I have to say that I am also in that category, which is part of the reason the study is important to me. And because of that, the key takeaways I think are going to be really important to a lot of people. And they're good for many things, not just chocolate. It's sort of an overall way to make sure that you're getting a healthy exposure to foods. The first one is diversity of diet, right? So don't always eat the same things over and over again, because if you do, then you're being exposed to the same things, right? So if this type of chocolate is higher in lead, then if you have it sporadically or you're changing the types of foods that you're having, you're going to change your risk. You're going to moderate your risk, kind of hedging your bets. And the second one is moderation. It's not always popular, but it really is kind of the really ultimate thing. You know, don't gorge yourself on chocolate, even though I know it's very hard. That chocolate is one of the ones that's really hard to moderate yourself on. Try to limit yourself to a 1-ounce serving size, and if you can't do that, maybe have it every other day, so it feels like more of a treat, and then you're also kind of giving yourself a break from that exposure.
And just to learn a little bit more about the key details of, this survey that you looked at, is the key source of these heavy metals then the origin countries that produce the cacao, or are they introduced during the processing phase?
This is a great question. We can't really be sure. We do know that the soil is a large source of these heavy metals, and so likely it is being introduced in the growing process. It's probably also being introduced during the drying process when these beans are laid outside. So if there's pollution or if they're near a factory, it's going to be exposed to that. But it can also be produced during the processing. For instance, if there's lead in any of the processing equipment. So it's a little bit unclear, but there are things that can be done to reduce those, which that's one of the exciting things for me.
And what are some of the things that can be done?
So some of the agricultural practices, and this is not my area of expertise, but I'm aware of them, is, for instance, you can change the pH of the soil, and that will change the amount of heavy metals that are absorbed from the plants. And then for processing, right, instead of laying them outside to dry, perhaps bringing them inside where they can be shielded from some of these additional exposures would also be beneficial. And then obviously looking at the equipment, making sure none of it is lead-based, things like that.
Mm-hmm. And Doctor, what are the current regulatory guidelines in the U.S. for these metals and arsenic in food, and how do those compare with international standards?
Great question. So there actually aren't standards for a lot of these from the FDA for adults. There are for children because they're a much higher risk group. Getting exposed to heavy metals in childhood can be quite detrimental. And so because of that, the regulatory it's not very strong. It's similar to many foods. You know, we sort of wait until we find something is wrong to really intervene. Like we're seeing with cinnamon as well, right? We're finding leaded cinnamon right now, and the FDA is going in and doing testing and fixing it. But it wasn't until we found that there was a problem that it's really being regulated. So it is a potential area for strengthening regulation.
We're getting into the little of, the weeds here, if you will, but what is some of the difference between the Prop 65 standard that was discussed in this study and the EPA standard, which says that these chocolate products are not really a danger to humans?
Yeah, so the example I like to use is that European guidelines and California guidelines tend to be a little more conservative. They want to make sure it's safe, and they're willing to do so on lower grade evidence. So rather than needing to have, like, for instance, a randomized control trial, they're willing to work with observational data. Whereas organizations like the FDA and EPA tend to want to have more solid science, which is fantastic. We love good science, but sometimes we don't have it. And so, do we wait till we find out that it's problematic? And that's where places like California tend to be a little bit more proactive. And so there is some debate whether the amounts that they have set are actually detrimental, but really the concern is how much your overall exposure is, because there is no zero exposure. Like you said earlier, it's in many different types of foods, and so we are all being exposed to it. We just need to make sure we're not being exposed to too much of it. And so having many elements that are at this higher level, this Prop 65 level, could be potentially a concern for certain people who are already being exposed. Maybe they have an environmental exposure, if they live in an apartment that has lead paint, things like that.
And for people like me who are dark chocolate addicts, how do you limit or avoid exposure? Are there specific brands that can be avoided? Is it the same sort of levels with milk chocolate or chocolate with, things like nuts in them, for example?
Great question. So there is no way to really avoid it in terms of brands. There's a lot of batch to batch variation. So just buying one brand, you're going to get a lot of variation even within that brand. Milk chocolate will have a little bit less because it has less cocoa in it, right? So it's the cocoa powder that is bringing this in there. So less cocoa powder will have less heavy metals, but then potentially also less of the health benefits, and maybe it has more sugar in it. So I wouldn't say that milk chocolate is a better way to go. Now, nuts, then you're kind of diluting it out in a different way. That's perhaps beneficial. But I think really the issue is just trying to limit the serving size, and then if you can't limit the serving size, to try and not have it every day.
All right, well, I'm kind of heartbroken by this study, but very grateful for the information. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Leigh Frame.
You're very welcome.